Hi, and welcome to the next segment of Learning with Powers. And I'm your host, Scott Powers Houston. And so this will be our second attempt at doing this particular episode because the last episode just somehow got deleted. And we're hoping that that doesn't happen again. Okay, so we're talking about Chinese paper and paper money and currency. And so the first thing I'm going to discuss is, what prompted me to do this segment, actually, I was watching Pawn Stars. And this guy Phineas comes on. This person brings in these supposed ancient Chinese banknotes. Now nobody has fake ancient Chinese banknotes. This is obviously, they just wanted to have that as like a segment so that they could talk about it. And then they bring in this guy Phineas, who just is full of crap. And I used to think that Pawn Stars gave good information about some of these things and you'd learn about stuff, but what Phineas said about ancient Chinese currency was just wrong. And I've looked up stuff on the internet and I realized that actually there's, again, a lot of false narratives out there. A lot of people don't really understand. They think they do. They think they're real smart because they looked it up, you know, in the internet. They think they know everything, but they don't. And so I'm here to blow apart false narratives, and so that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start with first the history of paper. Okay, so the first thing that we ever wrote on as humans was called, they were clay tablets, and in ancient Sumeria they used the clay tablets to write what's called cuneiform. And they would take this stylus, it had it was like a triangle kind of thing on it, and or 3 points, and they would make their alphabet or their language, you know, with using a stylus on these clay tablets. And the upside of these clay tablets is that we still have thousands of them today. There were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of them before, but we still have thousands of them today. In fact, you could buy one from an antique dealer for maybe 300 bucks or something. And you could even own one yourself, something that's 4,000 years old, some writing. And most of them are not very glamorous. It says something like Joe had 4 cows and 3 goats and things like that. I mean, it's just everyday like notes. And the problem with the cuneiform tablets, though, is it was limited, obviously, to how much you could write. So you couldn't write a novel on a little tablet like that. So basically, in Egypt, they developed a thing called papyrus. Now, why papyrus is not called paper, I don't really know entirely. Paper, I think, has to have certain kinds of fibers, and papyrus was made more or less from like fruit stems and things. The first paper that was ever invented is attributed to the Chinese, and that's true. Technically, if you want to call it paper, but the first paper that they created not only involved fruit fibers and fruit stems and things like that, which is you know, the same as papyrus, but it also included like torn up rags and a lot of other stuff, all mashed and compressed together, and I guess that's what makes it paper. I'm not sure, but all we have left of the earliest Chinese paper is a few fragments from the 1st century BC. And we're not sure exactly when it was that they started this process, but what we have is a few fragments of paper that they created in the 1st century BC. Now obviously the use of this paper was not prolific because all the things that are written down in Chinese history are all on bamboo. So like little pieces of bamboo, and they couldn't write, again, it's like a cuneiform tablet. You couldn't write a novel on there. You could just write a small amount of stuff. And it was written in the ancient Chinese text and not the more modern Chinese text. So even modern day Chinese people wouldn't be able to read it unless they were familiar with the old text. And so, because we have a lot more than that left of papyrus, even though papyrus, the shelf life was maybe 800 years, which is a long time, but if for something that, you know, was 2,500 years ago, 800 years is not good, because that means most of it's disintegrated by now. And so all we have of like original scrolls and original texts that were written 2,000 years ago or longer is mostly just the same thing, it's fragments. The reason why we have the knowledge of what was written at that time is because in the Middle Ages, and we're talking like from like between 400 and like maybe 900 AD, you had monks. So as I was saying, so these monks noticed that these ancient scrolls written on papyrus were starting to dangerously deteriorate around 500 AD or so. And from that time, they started to furiously copy down everything that was written on these scrolls. And as far as we can tell, their intent was to just copy everything that was written rather than try to edit it or anything like that. And so they wrote it on parchment, or even which is actually animal skin, or even a better quality of parchment, which is what's called vellum. And so then eventually the type of paper that we know of today, they did come up with more, like a more usable type of a paper in around the early 1400s in Europe. And that technology actually did come over from China, across the Silk Route, and into Europe that way, the Middle East and then Europe. And that was the type of paper that was used to print, you know, the first printing press that we had in the 1400s, you know, was using the older style paper. Eventually in about the 1700s we did have wood-based paper, and in the early 1800s we were able to actually manufacture this wood-based paper and start to create the kind of paper that we know of today. But it wasn't really until about 200 years ago. And so this early paper that the Chinese made, going as far back as the 1st century BC, and may have been longer before that, we can only speculate, but all we have are fragments. And so we have more than that of the scrolls, despite the fact that the Mongolians came in and burned down the library at Alexandria. Hundreds, or well, at least tens of thousands of scrolls were burned. But despite all that, we still have, and a lot of them were destroyed again when the Visigoths were invaded Italy and destroyed a lot of the scrolls at that time. But despite all that, we still have a lot of scrolls remaining. Now, nobody invaded China and destroyed all their scrolls, but all we have are a few fragments. So obviously there was not prolific use. And one of the reasons why is because it was harder to make. Just the process for making paper was a lot more difficult, and so they just didn't do it that much. But ultimately it was paper. So coins in China, we showed you the early coinage in China. Actually, China probably had the very first type of currency, or any kind of currency, with the knife money. They used boat money in Siam, which is Thailand today. But you know, Greece came out with coins, maybe 450 BC-ish, around that time. So it's around the same time, call it 500 BC. 600 BC maybe, and then around the maybe 350 BC, China actually came out with coins, but they were used concurrently with the other kind of currency. It wasn't until around maybe 200 BC, or well, actually maybe until around 0, that they were coins exclusively. Now these coins were called cash coins, and each coin was worth 1 cash, and they were all the same size, and they were made out of bronze, and they had a hole punched out of them, and they were meant to be carried on a string. Now, Chinese currency was not backed by gold or silver. The whole concept that gold and silver is money is entirely a Western concept. And so this is where Phineas, for example, was absolutely wrong when he says this early form of Chinese currency, oh, you can see there's 2 units of gold and these are the units of silver that this paper was worth. That's complete BS, because gold and silver was not currency in China. cash coins were currency, and sometimes they would make a larger one, like they would make a 2 cash or a 3 cash or a 4 cash or even a 10 cash coin, and they would be bigger, but not because that amount of bronze was worth X amount of money. It was just to denominate a different denomination. So that was, and so they just made them bigger just to indicate that it was a bigger denomination. But the amount of bronze that was used had nothing to do with the value of the bronze, because actually 1 cash was essentially about $1-ish. That same unit of currency was made in the Roman Empire, only their bronze coins were, and actually they were copper coins, were much bigger. And so to have basically the same amount of value in the Roman Empire, which did use gold and silver as money, you would have needed a lot more copper to be worth the same amount of value that it was worth in China. So why was this little coin worth that much money in China? And basically that brings us to what China did probably sort of invent, but it was inadvertent. So China likes to put out a lot of false narratives about itself. They like to put out, hey, we were the first ones to invent paper, we're the first ones to have paper currency, and this is a dialogue and a narrative that they aggressively put out over the internet, and people from the West just suck it up like little guppies. And all the educators in the West will, read this on the internet and they're like, oh yes, well China actually had the first, and they think they're being so smart and so clever when actually they don't know what they're talking about, because it's all false narrative. And the reason why the Chinese spread these narratives and work so hard to spread these narratives is because basically they want to spread the image of that the Chinese are a superior race, and it really is about that. And having lived there for as long as I did, you realize that's really what it's all about, that they believe that they are the superior race. And they want the world, and especially the West, to believe that Chinese culture is now and has always been much more advanced and superior to Western culture. And that's really the image that they want everybody to have. And the administrators and the educators in the West have just embraced this as gospel, and that's what they're teaching everybody, but it's wrong. And it's dangerously wrong, unfortunately. And you've got people like Gavin Menzies and people like that are really jumping on the bandwagon here, trying to sell books, knowing that the market is Asia and that they'll eat it up. He writes something like, oh, actually the Chinese invented this or discovered this first, and they'll eat it up. We'll get to that in another lesson. Back to currency. So anyway, so what the Chinese did do, however, that they don't lay claim to, but in fact they did actually have the very first credit-based currency. That was clearly credit-based currency, and it was based on the fact that the Chinese government made these bronze coins. They said it was worth 1 cash, and the citizens trusted the government and accepted that they were worth 1 cash, and that's what gave it value. Outside of China, it did not have that much value, and in fact it had very little value in the West, because a very small bronze coin with a hole in it on top of that was very little actual bronze or copper in there, and so it really didn't have a lot of value, and they were just kind of collected as, oh, it's Chinese money, it's like a token. But in China it was money, and it was money for 2,000 years. And so you could say, so China, if they really want to make a legitimate claim, they should say, we invented credit-based currency. And they kind of can do that. But in fact, all currency, especially all currency today, but in actuality, all currency all throughout history has been credit-based. Gold and silver, even though it's regarded in the West as that's money, it never really was. It was accepted as money, and the weight of gold or the weight of silver was how much it was worth, but it was still contingent on the market value of whatever gold or silver was worth at that time, which fluctuated greatly. And just ask the Spanish, who went to the Americas, discovered the Potosi Mint in Bolivia, and they brought back, tons and tons and tons of silver, and all they did was flood the market with silver, and as they kept introducing more silver to the market and discovering more silver and producing more silver from the Potosi Mint, the value of silver went down and down and down and down and down, and the economy of Spain actually tanked, and they became actually very poor by the late 1800s. So just ask them how much gold and silver is money. It's not. It wasn't then. It's not. Certainly not now. And it wasn't even in the past. But actually, China is where it was clear that it was just it was a credit-based currency. Okay, and so these coins had holes in them, and so they would wear them on a string like that. Now, paper money. The first paper money that we've got evidence of is actually from the Song dynasty. So that's before the Yuan dynasty. Now, the advantage of paper in general, or papyrus, is that the one disadvantage to cuneiform is that you couldn't really write much. And although we have today the Epic of Gilgamesh from several larger tablets that was made, it was still very difficult to write a story of any length on tablets. And actually in China, they didn't really write a lot of stories either. You know, most of the writing was still written on pieces of bamboo. And so most all writing in the history was like these Twitter type statements and things like that. These Chinese proverbs or whatever. And as we came up with papyrus, now you could have a scroll. And so now you could write like a whole play or something like the Greeks did. And then the Romans took that over as well. And so that was the immediate advantage of papyrus. And then when they came out with parchment, they actually came out with like sheets of paper, and then that's when they came out with things called a codex, which was sort of like the first book, where they would like bind all these pages of parchment together, and that's when we had the first books. But anyway, that's another lesson. So the first currency that was paper was actually made in China, and but we only have a few samples that survive. And the samples that survive, the most famous sample is from the early Ming Dynasty from around 1360 AD. And it's the same image that everybody knows of. And of course the Chinese imply that, oh, we made millions of these and it was prolifically used. But if it was prolifically used, then where are they? Where are they? They're extremely rare. There are maybe less than 10 samples in the world, and if there's more than 10, then there's not more than 20. But they are extremely rare, which is why someone didn't just walk off the street and have one, at which Phineas said it was a fake, but nobody could have one. It's like walking off the street and saying, oh look, I have a 1913 V nickel. Of course not. The earliest fragments of the paper money that we have is from the Song dynasty. Again, we just have a few fragments from around 1100 AD or so. The first full piece that still survives is from the Ming dynasty. Now, it's said that the Yuan dynasty, or actually they said on Pawn Stars that the Yuan dynasty banned coins, and they used exclusively paper. This is complete BS. The Yuan dynasty was a Mongolian dynasty, and they didn't really make anything. I mean, that's why Ming vases are so valuable, because Yuan vases are basically non-existent, and then there are Song era dynasties, Song dynasty vases, but they're just not as ornate, as interesting. The pretty ones are Ming dynasty. It's just because they didn't make much of anything. It was a very poor, difficult time in China. But they did make coins. And they're not that rare. I've got a few. They're ownable. The average person can own one. They're hard to find, very hard to find, and it's best to be in Asia to find them. But they obviously were not banned. They did make Yuan dynasty coins, and I have not seen any samples of Yuan dynasty paper money, ever. And so if they used it so prolifically and everybody used it as their money, where is it? What happened to it? Oh, well, it disintegrated. Well, yeah, a lot of it. But all of it? 100%? Not likely. I mean, 100% of parchment is not gone. That was used prolifically. That's not all gone. Why is all the Yuan dynasty currency gone then? So, money that was made by the Chinese was never prolifically used. And in fact, it wasn't prolifically used really ever. And the first culture to really prolifically use paper money was the West. And it was started in around 1500 or so. And it was very big. And it was meant to be used for large transactions. And so in China, like a 1 cash coin or a silver penny like we had in the West for so many hundreds of years, that was the standard currency that we used, a little silver penny with a cross on the back. You didn't need much more than that. You know, everything costs about $1. You know, you wanted to buy, I mean, everything could be bought in that. There wasn't a lot of things to buy in those days. As we came up with more stuff, more things to buy, that's when we needed more different denominations. That's when that became more necessary. And it's why you don't even see 2 or 3 cash coin sizes until like around 1000 AD, and even in China, because before that time it just wasn't necessary to have all these different denominations. Although in Greece, they did have a lot of different denominations. And basically all of the Greek denominations were smaller, smaller, and even smaller. And they made coins that were really, really tiny. The obols. So anyway, moving on. So you say, well, if China did not care about gold and silver, well, they had gold and silver. They did make some objects out of gold and silver, but it was not very much. It was very, very rare. But what happened in the early 1500s, the Portuguese basically came and they introduced more or less silver to China. And the Chinese immediately became obsessed with it. And they loved it. And they wanted silver all the time, and that was their preferred method of exchange, was they wanted silver from the Portuguese. And then they started making these silver tails, or they're called saices, and they're stackable. Forgot to show that. So they're about this big, and they're like hollowed out a little bit so that you could stack them or whatever. It looks like a little anvil that's kind of hollowed out. It's called saices. And the Chinese made lots and lots of these saices, and they were used eventually as currency, but not necessarily because of the value of silver per se. It still never really became a gold and silver based currency. They still kept making the cash coins, and they kept making the cash coins, in fact, all the way until 1908, the end of the Qing dynasty. And it wasn't until the end of the Qing dynasty that that was discontinued. And so gold and silver, like I said, was never money in China, even though they did covet these silver saices. And if you find a saisi, it's probably not silver, it's probably pewter, because there's a lot of fakes out there. It's hard to find the silver ones, actually, but they do exist. Okay, so that concludes this episode of Chinese currency and paper. Thank you for joining us. I'm Scott Powers Houston, and this was Learning with Power. See you next time.